Murder is the third leading cause of death for Native women. But in 1887, for one woman, the greatest danger wasn't a bullet or a blade, it was a marriage license. Her name was Ilara, and she arrived in a town that had already written her ending before she stepped off the train. Ilara was Arapaho, entering a Wyoming settlement where a law from 1691 still poisoned the well. Her union with a grieving rancher wasn't a love story, it was a transaction in a community that saw her as less than human. This is what happened when the one person they all despised became the only person they needed. Clear Fork, Wyoming, 1887. The air didn't just carry dust, it carried the weight of a Virginia law written 2 centuries prior, one that had seeped into the territorial statutes like a stain. It declared marriage between a white settler and a native person an unnatural union, punishable by exile or worse. But Thomas Caldwell had run out of options. His wife Mary had been gone for 11 months. Consumption. It left him with 300 acres of brittle land, a mortgage held by the bank in Cheyenne, and 4 children under the age of 10. The oldest, Jacob, was 9 and trying to be a man. The twins, Eva and Elijah, were 6 and quiet as shadows. The baby, Lily, was 2 and still woke, crying for a mother who would never come. The house was falling apart. The church women had stopped bringing casseroles after the 3rd month. Help wanted ads in the Clear Fork Gazette went unanswered. No woman in the territory, they said, would step into a situation that desperate. Meanwhile, 40 miles north at the Fort Washakie Agency, 24-year-old Ilara was trapped in a different kind of calculus. Her Arapaho name was Itzie, meaning flower, but the Indian agents had rechristened her Ilara Brown. Her family had been fragmented by the Shoshone-Arapaho Wars and the relentless push of the railroad. She spoke 3 languages, could break a wild horse, and knew which routes could bring down a fever. But in the eyes of the Office of Indian Affairs, she was a surplus woman, a drain on rations, unmarried, and therefore a problem to be solved. The solution arrived in the form of Reverend Silas Holt. A man of gaunt frame and circular logic, he believed in saving souls through strategic placement. He had preached to Thomas's wife on her deathbed. He knew the rancher's dire need. He also administered the agency's assimilation through domestic service program. It was a brutal equation, an unwanted woman for an untenable home. He proposed a contract, not a courtship. Ilara would become Mrs. Caldwell. In exchange, she would receive room, board, and civilizing influence. Thomas would receive labor and a semblance of a household. The Reverend would receive a note from the Indian agent praising his progressive work. The legal loophole was thin but critical. Wyoming territory, while adhering to the spirit of anti-miscegenation, had not yet codified it. The marriage could be recorded as a Christian service arrangement if performed by a minister. It was a transaction dressed in scripture. The wedding was held in the Reverend Stark office, not the church. No family attended from either side. Thomas wore his one clean shirt, the collar frayed. Ilara wore a dark wool dress issued by the agency, 2 sizes too large. She held a small bundle containing her personal effects, a piece of saddle leather tooled by her brother, a dried sprig of sage, and a photograph of her mother taken by an army surveyor. When Reverend Holt pronounced them man and wife, the only sound was the scratching of his pen in the ledger. The news spread through Clear Fork before their wagon even left town. At the general store, the postmaster refused to hand Thomas his mail, looking straight through Ilara as if she were a ghost. Children pointed from behind their mothers' skirts. The bank manager, Elias Sweeney, watched from his window and made a note in his own ledger, a moral clause in Thomas's mortgage he now considered activated. The ride to the Caldwell Ranch was a 17-mile silence broken only by the wind. Thomas stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the reins. Ilara studied the land, the first real expanse she'd seen in years. It wasn't the rolling freedom of her childhood, but it was open. She could see the exhaustion in Thomas's posture, the way his shoulders slumped not from weight, but from defeat. The house, when it appeared, was a testament to that defeat. A 2-room cabin, its chinking crumbling, the roof sagging on one side. A few chickens pecked listlessly in the dirt. The children were lined up on the porch like little soldiers. Jacob, the 9-year-old, held Lily on his hip, his expression a mask of wary hostility. The twins just stared, their eyes wide. Thomas stopped the wagon. "This is Ilara," he said, his voice flat. "She's here to help." No one moved. Then Lily, the 2-year-old, squirmed in Jacob's arms, reached out a chubby hand, and said the only word that mattered in her world: "Mama." The air went taut. Jacob's face flushed red. "She ain't Mama," he hissed, yanking his sister back. Thomas closed his eyes for a second, a flicker of pure pain. "Inside," he said, the word a command. That first night, Ilara was given a corner of the main room, separated by a hung blanket. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, the children's restless sleep, Thomas's packing in the yard, the relentless Wyoming wind trying to get in. She thought of the agency, of the Reverend's smug satisfaction, of the town's cold stares. This was her choice: the prison of the reservation or the battlefield of this broken home. At dawn, she rose before anyone else. She found the kitchen in disarray, flour spilled, dishes crusted, a sour smell rising from a milk pail. She rolled up her sleeves, built up the fire, and began. She didn't wait for instruction or permission. She heated water, scrubbed, sorted. When the children awoke, she had flatbread warming on the stove, made from the last of the cornmeal. They ate in silence, watching her every move. Days fell into a strained rhythm. Ilara worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences with Thomas, tending the garden, quieting Lily's nightmares. The children obeyed her direct commands, but offered no warmth. Jacob, in particular, was a fortress. He would undo tasks she had completed, fixing them his way, he whispered to his siblings when she passed. The town's prejudice was a constant, low-grade fever. When Thomas took her for supplies the following week, the storekeeper, Mr. Dobson, added a non-member surcharge to their bill, 20% extra for outsiders. Thomas paid it without a word, his jaw clenched. On the way out, Dobson's wife leaned over the counter and said, just loud enough, "Some stains don't wash out, Mr. Caldwell. Think of your children's future." The true turning point came 3 weeks in, with the first autumn storm. A sudden gale tore a section of the barn roof clean off. Thomas and Jacob were in Cheyenne fetching a repaired plow blade. The sky turned black, and hail began to fall, sharp as nails. The twins screamed as wind howled through the cabin. Ilara saw the chickens scattering, the horses panicking in the pasture. She didn't hesitate. She wrapped Lily in a blanket and thrust her into Eva's arms. "Stay under the table," she ordered. To Elijah she said, "Hold the door." She ran out into the stinging ice. The hail was brutal. She fought the wind to the barn, her dress soaked and tearing. The horses were rearing, eyes wild. She spoke to them in low, steady Arapaho, a language of calm her father had used with mustangs. She got a lead on the mare, then the gelding, and led them to the relative shelter of the lee side. Then, with numb hands, she dragged tarps and spare lumber over the worst of the roof gap, weighting them with stones. By the time Thomas's wagon raced into the yard an hour later, the crisis was contained. He found Ilara in the barn, soaked to the bone, her hands bleeding from the rough wood, still soothing the trembling horses. The children were safe in the house. For the first time, his mask of grim endurance cracked, revealing something underneath, not gratitude, not yet, but a dawning, terrible realization. He had brought a woman into his home as an appliance, a solution to a labor problem, but in that storm, she had acted not as a servant, but as a protector. The very identity his community despised was the one that had just saved his livelihood. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He simply took the horse's lead rope from her shaking hands. Their eyes met for a stretched second in the dim barn light. The unspoken truth hung between them, more dangerous than any storm. If the town found out he was starting to see her as a person, and not just help, they would destroy him for it. That silent realization in the barn was a fault line, and the first tremor came not from the town, but from within the house itself. Jacob, the 9-year-old, had been listening at the window. He heard the unspoken shift in his father's silence, and he decided to fight back. His weapon was a memory. The next morning, as Ilara tried to show Eva how to knead dough, Jacob walked to the mantel. He took down the only photograph in the house, a tintype of his mother Mary, her face gentle and faded. He placed it squarely on the kitchen table, right where Ilara was working. He didn't say a word. He just stared at her, his eyes challenging. The message was clear: you are an intruder in her place. Ilara looked at the photograph, then at the boy's defiant face. She didn't remove it. She didn't get angry. She simply nodded, a slow, acknowledging dip of her head, and continued getting Eva's small hands in the flour. Her reaction, a quiet respect instead of a confrontation, confused Jacob. It disarmed his anger, leaving only a raw, aching sadness. He snatched the picture back and fled to the barn. Thomas saw the entire exchange from the doorway. That evening, after the children were asleep, he did something he hadn't done since Mary died. He spoke of her. He told Ilara, in halting sentences, about the farm back in Ohio, about the journey west that had broken her health, about her love for lilacs that wouldn't grow in the Wyoming clay. It wasn't an apology to Ilara. It was an offering, a fragile thread of trust. Ilara, in turn, began to share in subtle ways. She didn't speak of the agency or the loss directly. Instead, she showed. She used her knowledge of plants not just for medicine, but for beauty. She found wild flax and wove it into a small, blue-edged blanket for Lily. She showed Elijah how to whistle using a blade of prairie grass. She identified bird calls for the twins, giving names to the sounds that filled their silence. One afternoon, she found Jacob trying to repair a broken harness strap, his small hands struggling with the awl. She sat beside him, took the leather and the tool, and without a word demonstrated the saddle stitch her brother had taught her, a method stronger and cleaner than the one he was attempting. He watched, his suspicion warring with a boy's genuine curiosity about a better way to fix things. When she handed the work back, he didn't thank her, but he didn't throw it aside either. This fragile private thaw was happening inside a house that was becoming a fortress under siege. The public pressure from Clear Fork was crystallizing into action. Elias Sweeney, the bank manager, made good on his silent threat. A formal letter arrived, citing a morality clause buried in the original mortgage paperwork. It stated the bank could call the loan due immediately if the borrower engaged in conduct unbefitting a Christian settler and detrimental to community standing. Thomas's marriage was the cited conduct. He had 90 days to repay the entire $800 balance, or the ranch would be forfeit. $800 was an impossible sum. It was more than 3 years of good harvests which they hadn't had. Thomas rode into town to confront Sweeney. The meeting was short. Sweeney, a deacon at Reverend Holt's church, leaned back in his chair. "It's not personal, Caldwell. It's about stability. That woman, her presence undermines the social order. It sets a bad example. What if every man here decided to solve his problems that way? We are building a civilization, not reverting to savagery." The words were a direct echo of the 1691 statute. Thomas left the bank, the weight of the debt like a physical chain. As he mounted his horse, he saw a group of men, Dobson the storekeeper, the blacksmith, and 2 others, watching him from the porch of the saloon. Their expressions weren't of hatred, but of cold, satisfied judgment. He was now a warning to others. He returned home and didn't hide the letter. He showed it to Ilara. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly over the legal words. She understood the consequence not just for him, but for her. If the ranch was lost, she would be returned to the agency as a failed experiment, likely sent to a far worse situation. "There is another way," she said, her voice low. Thomas looked at her, exhausted. "I have no family to borrow from. No one here will lend to me." "Not money," Ilara said. "Horses." She explained. The 2 workhorses were adequate, but the mare, the one she'd calmed in the storm, had fine lines. She was a crossbreed part Mustang with endurance in her bones, and the gelding was strong. On the northern part of their land, near a rocky outcrop, wild blue flax grew excellent forage. If they could separate the mare and gelding, manage the grazing carefully, and if the mare was bred to a quality stallion, they could raise and sell horses. Cavalry outposts, freight companies, and even the railroad were always buying. It was a multi-year plan, but it was a plan. Thomas listened, a flicker of the old stubborn hope returning. It was a gamble. It required work they didn't have time for, knowledge he didn't possess, but Ilara possessed it. For the first time, their partnership moved beyond domestic survival into a shared strategy for the future. He agreed. This new, deliberate collaboration did not go unnoticed by the children. They saw their father consulting Ilara on land matters, saw them working together in the far pasture, building a rough corral. The dynamic in the house shifted from a tense occupancy to a busy, purposeful hive. Jacob, tasked with helping build the fence posts, found himself taking orders from Ilara on how to set them deep enough to withstand winter. He resisted at first, but her instructions were clear, correct, and saved him from doing the work twice. Then the first true test of her belonging arrived with a high fever. It was Lily, the baby. One night she began burning up, her cries weak and thready. The town doctor, an elderly man named Higgins, was summoned. He came, examined the child in the dim light, and shook his head. Childbed fever or something like it. Keep her comfortable. There's not much to be done. Thomas felt the old despair returning, but Ilara moved. She ignored the doctor's pronouncement. She sent Elijah to fetch specific bark from a willow grove near the creek. She had Eva crush dried mint from her small garden. She prepared a bitter tea and, holding the delirious child, coaxed drops past her lips. She used cool cloths in a specific pattern the doctor frowned at. She sang, not a hymn, but a low, repetitive Arapaho song her grandmother had used for healing. Dr. Higgins watched this with increasing discomfort. "Superstition," he muttered to Thomas. "Heathen practices, you're risking the child." Thomas, watching the fierce, focused tenderness on Ilara's face, made a choice. He said, "Thank you for coming, doctor. We'll manage here." The doctor left, insulted. For 48 hours, Ilara didn't sleep. She fought for Lily's life with every piece of knowledge she had, both from her people and from observing the agency's physician. On the third morning, the fever broke. Lily opened her eyes, whimpered for water, and then slept a normal, peaceful sleep. The victory was private, profound, and politically catastrophic. Dr. Higgins returned to Clear Fork and didn't speak of the child's recovery. He spoke of being dismissed in favor of Indian witchcraft. The story mutated. By Sunday, Reverend Holt was preaching from Proverbs about the foreign woman whose lips drip honey, but whose path leads to death. No names were used. Everyone knew. The sermon had a direct effect. The following Thursday, the schoolma'am, Miss Alice, a frail woman who had once brought the children primers, appeared at the ranch boundary. She would not cross onto the property. She called Thomas over. Her message was simple. Jacob, Eva, and Elijah were no longer welcome at the Clear Fork school. The other parents had protested. It was felt that their home environment now posed a moral and hygienic risk to the other children. Education was Thomas's last hope for his children's future. This was a blow designed to break him. He stood at the fence, watching the schoolma'am's hurried retreat, feeling the walls close in completely. He turned to look at his home. He saw Ilara in the garden, the twins helping her plant late-season turnips. He saw Jacob chopping wood, his movements stronger, more confident. He saw a home that was functioning, even thriving, in direct defiance of the world outside. A cold resolve settled over him. They could take his credit, his standing, even his children's school, but they would not take his land. And they would not dictate who belonged under his roof. The quiet man who had accepted his fate for over a year was gone. In his place was a man ready to wage a war of stubbornness. He marched into the house, took down the old rifle above the fireplace, and began cleaning it methodically. Ilara came in, her hands soiled from the earth. She saw the gun, saw his face. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice calm. "Preparing," Thomas said, not looking up. "Sweeney and Holt, they won't stop with letters and sermons. They'll send a committee, maybe the sheriff. They'll try to force me to annul the marriage, to send you back, to get their way." Ilara watched him for a long moment. "That gun will only solve one kind of problem," she said, "and it will create 100 more." She walked to the table, sat across from him. "They think I make you weak, that I am a corruption. We must show them the opposite." "How?" Thomas asked, the frustration boiling over. "By being better farmers. They've already decided we don't belong." "No," Ilara said, her dark eyes steady. "By being indispensable, not to them, but to something they need." She laid out a new, audacious plan. The coming winter would be hard. Isolated homesteads further up the valley would be cut off. Illness, injury, and shortage would strike. Dr. Higgins was old and reluctant to travel far. Reverend Holt offered prayers, not practical aid. "We have food put by. I have medicines. You know how to fix roofs and broken wheels," she said. "When their own community fails them, we will be there, not as a husband and his Indian wife, but as neighbors. We will make them indebted to the very thing they despise." It was a strategy of radical leverage. Instead of defending their border, they would extend their influence. They would weave themselves into the fabric of the valley's survival until to tear them out would cause the whole tapestry to unravel. Thomas put the rifle down. He looked at this woman, whom he had married for a bucket of water and was now proposing to fight a war with grace and grit. He nodded. The first opportunity came sooner than expected. A week later, a rider came pounding into their yard at dusk. It was young Billy Dobson, the storekeeper's son, his face pale with panic. His family's homestead was 10 miles north. His mother was in labor, and it was going badly. The baby was breech. Dr. Higgins was away in Cheyenne. They'd heard Mrs. Caldwell had a way with healing. Mrs. Caldwell, the title, used for the first time by an outsider, hung in the air. Ilara and Thomas exchanged a glance. This was the wife of the man leading the charge against them. Helping could be seen as weakness. Refusing would be a death sentence for a woman and child and would confirm every vile stereotype. Ilara moved. She gathered her kit, her herbs, clean cloths, a sharp, small knife she kept sterilized in alcohol. Thomas hitched the wagon. Without a word, Jacob climbed up beside him, his face set. They rode into the gathering dark toward the home of their enemy to save 2 lives. The battle for Clear Fork was no longer about holding a line. It was about to be fought in a blood-soaked cabin with Ilara's skilled hands as the only weapon. The cabin was a tableau of primal terror. Abigail Dobson was drenched in sweat, her cries reduced to ragged gasps. Her husband, the storekeeper who had charged the 20% surcharge, stood paralyzed in the corner, his face ashen. The local midwife had already given up, whispering prayers. Into this scene stepped Ilara, her hands steady, her mind clearing of everything but the geometry of life and death. She dismissed the hovering men with a sharp command in English that brooked no argument. Thomas guided a stunned Mr. Dobson outside. Jacob, wide-eyed, remained by the door, ordered to boil more water. Ilara's touch was firm, assessing. The baby was indeed breech, 1 foot already presenting, the cord a dangerous threat. The textbooks at the agency had diagrams. The elder women of her band had stories. She combined both. She spoke softly to Abigail, not with empty comfort, but with direct instruction. You must turn. When I say you push not down but to the side, your body knows even if you are tired. Using oil and a precise, fearless manipulation, she worked to create space to guide the tiny hips, to prevent the shoulder from catching. It was a brutal, minutes-long ballet of pressure and release. Abigail screamed. Ilara murmured in Arapaho, a song for courage. And with a final, monumental effort from the mother and a gidding twist from Ilara, the baby slid free, a boy blue and silent. The midwife gasped. Ilara cleared his mouth, rubbed his back briskly, then bent and breathed 2 small puffs of air into his mouth. A slap, gentle but firm, on the soles of his feet. A shudder, a weak, protesting cry that grew stronger. She placed the squalling infant on his mother's chest and immediately turned to deliver the placenta, ensuring Abigail's safety. In the yard, the men heard the baby's cry. Mr. Dobson sank to his knees, sobbing in relief. Thomas stood stiffly, his own heart hammering. Jacob stared from the doorway, his view of Ilara forever altered. He didn't see an Indian woman or a substitute mother. He saw a person who commanded life itself in a room where death had been waiting. Ilara emerged an hour later, exhausted, her dress stained. She gave instructions for the mother's care to the weeping midwife. Mr. Dobson stumbled toward her, tears on his cheeks. "Thank you," he choked out. "Name your price." Ilara looked at him, then at Thomas. "The surcharge," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "End it for everyone." Dobson nodded wildly. "Done, it's done." The ride home was made in a profound new silence. Jacob kept glancing at Ilara with something like awe. Thomas felt a surge of hope. This would change things. A life saved, a debt owed. The ice was breaking. He was wrong. The ice was merely cracking to reveal a deeper, colder current beneath. Reverend Silas Holt heard the story within a day. He did not hear a tale of mercy and skill. He heard a narrative of dangerous influence. A white woman's most vulnerable moment, her body and the life of her child, had been under the control of a savage. That Ilara had succeeded was not a credit to her. It was, in his twisted logic, proof of her sinister power. He preached the next Sunday on the story of the Witch of Endor, who conjured spirits. The analogy was not subtle. The undercurrent of gossip in Clear Fork turned toxic. Whispers replaced shouts, which were more dangerous. How did she know what to do? What kind of unholy knowledge does she have? She breathed life into that baby like a pagan ritual. Dr. Higgins, his pride wounded, stoked these embers. He began to speak of contamination and spiritual malady. The tangible backlash came from an unexpected quarter. 3 days after the birth, a federal marshal rode into Clear Fork. He was not there for the Caldwells. He was there on a routine circuit, but Reverend Holt and Elias Sweeney invited him for a private dinner. They presented a community concern. They argued that Thomas Caldwell's marriage to a ward of the Office of Indian Affairs might constitute fraud, obtaining domestic labor under the guise of matrimony, circumventing both agency oversight and territorial law. They suggested the marriage should be investigated, possibly annulled, and Ilara returned to federal custody for her own protection and the community's safety. The marshal, a pragmatic man more concerned with cattle rustlers than marital law, was unmoved by the moral arguments. But the legal one, the potential misrepresentation to a federal agency, piqued his interest. He agreed to review the marriage record and Reverend Holt's contract. When Thomas learned of this, the hope that had blossomed after the Dobson birth withered. An annulment would not just send Ilara back, it would render her time with him a legal nullity, stripping her of any claim to even the fragile protection his name offered. She would be a pariah twice over, and the bank would get its land. Ilara understood the stakes with chilling clarity. Returning to the agency was a death sentence of a different kind. "They will send me farther away," she told Thomas that night, "to a school or a laundry. I will not see the sky like this again." The threat forged their private bond into steel. That night, for the first time, Thomas did not retreat to his solitary cot after the children slept. He sat with Ilara at the kitchen table, the single lantern between them. They talked not as rescuer and rescued, nor as employer and employee, but as allies in a siege. He told her of his dream for the land, not just to keep it, but to make it thrive for Jacob, for the twins. She spoke of her mother, of the wide plains before the fences, not with longing for a lost past, but with a keen understanding of how living systems work, a knowledge she was applying to his failing fields. It was during this conversation that Jacob, unable to sleep, eavesdropped again. But this time, he didn't hear a threat to his mother's memory. He heard two people planning a future that included him. The last fortress wall around his heart crumbled silently in the dark. The next morning, Jacob approached Ilara as she fed the chickens. He didn't look at her face. He scuffed his boot in the dirt. "I could help more with the horses," he mumbled. "I'm strong enough." It was a peace offering, a boy's version of a treaty. Ilara simply nodded. "After chores," she said, "I will show you." But the outside world was not done applying pressure. The marshal's inquiry, though slow, was a looming cloud. Then a more immediate crisis struck. A fire broke out at the livery stable in Clear Fork. It was a windy night, and the flames threatened to engulf half the main street. Every able-bodied man from miles around raced to fight it, forming bucket brigades from the creek. Thomas and Jacob went. Ilara, left with the younger children, watched the ominous glow in the night sky. Then she acted. She hitched the wagon alone, loaded it with every bucket and pot they owned, and drove toward town. She did not go to the fire line, where she would be reviled and turned away. She went to the creek upstream. With Eva and Elijah filling buckets, she formed her own solitary brigade, ferrying water to the exhausted men at the end of the line where the effort was failing. She worked in silence, a shadowy figure passing full buckets and taking empty ones, her presence noted but not acknowledged in the frenzy. The fire was contained just before dawn, saving the mercantile and the post office. As the men collapsed in sooty exhaustion, the truth of her contribution was undeniable. She had provided the margin that prevented total disaster. The gratitude was muted, confused, but it was there in the avoiding eyes and the grudging nods. This second act of indispensable aid, following the childbirth, created a schism in Clear Fork. A silent minority, the Dobsons, the blacksmith whose shop was saved, a few homesteaders who remembered her kindness with a poultice for a child's burn, began to question the Reverend's narrative. The conflict was no longer just between the Caldwells and the town. It was within the town's own conscience. Reverend Holt recognized this danger immediately. He needed a definitive, public victory to reaffirm his moral authority. He found it in the person of Clyde Burton, a brutish trapper who lived on the fringe of society and who harbored a violent grudge against all Indians. Holt didn't order violence. He simply preached, within earshot of Burton, about the unclean thing festering in their midst, a poison to the valley's purity. He spoke of righteous anger being a tool of the Lord. Clyde Burton heard his calling. One evening, as Thomas was checking the new horse corral a mile from the house, Burton emerged from the scrub. He was drunk, armed with a knife and a coiled whip. "Come to clean up the mess the preacher's too polite to handle," he slurred. "Gonna send your squaw back to the dirt where she belongs." Thomas, unarmed, raised his hands. "There's no trouble here, Burton, just move on." Burton lunged. It was not a fight, but an assault. The whip cracked, slicing Thomas's forearm. The knife flashed. Thomas, a farmer not a fighter, managed to grapple with him, the two men rolling in the dirt. It was the sound of the struggling horses that saved him. Jacob, coming to help his father, heard the commotion and came running. He didn't hesitate. He picked up a stout fence post and brought it down on Burton's head with all the fury of a boy defending his home. The trapper went still. Thomas, bleeding and shaken, looked at his son, then at the unconscious man. This was the precipice. If Burton died, it was murder. If he lived, he would cry assault. Either way, the law would come down on Jacob, and the Reverend would use it to destroy them completely. They dragged Burton to his own scrawny horse, tied him across the saddle, and sent it toward town. They then concocted a story. Thomas had surprised Burton trying to steal horses, and in the struggle, Burton had fallen and hit his head. It was thin, but it was all they had. Back at the house, as Ilara cleaned Thomas's wounds, the full weight of their situation settled upon them. They were cornered. The bank was ready to foreclose. The law was sniffing around their marriage. The town's hidden violence had now erupted into the open, and a 9-year-old boy had been forced to commit near-lethal violence to protect his family. Ilara finished wrapping Thomas's arm. Her hands were calm, but her eyes held a storm. "We cannot just survive their attacks anymore," she said, her voice low and final. "We must end the war, and there is only one way to do that. We must force the territory to see us, not as a problem, but as a fact it cannot erase." She proposed a move of breathtaking audacity. They would not wait for the marshal's verdict or the bank's deadline. They would go on the offensive. They would travel to Cheyenne, the territorial capital, and before any judge or official who would listen, they would demand a formal, legal recognition of their marriage under the laws of the United States. They would force the system to look at its own contradictions. It was a gamble that risked everything, for a prize no one like them had ever claimed. They would either secure their future or be completely obliterated by the glare of public law. The journey to Cheyenne was a traverse through a different kind of wilderness, one of paperwork, precedent, and polite, institutional disdain. Thomas and Ilara walked into the territorial courthouse not as a loving couple, but as petitioners armed with a marriage certificate, Reverend Holt's contract, and a desperate, fragile claim to personhood under the law. They were not alone. Jacob insisted on coming. He was the witness, he said, to everything. The twins and Lily were left in the care of Abigail Dobson, a quiet act of rebellion and repayment that spoke volumes in Clear Fork's silent war. Their target was not a judge, but a clerk of records, a weary man named Arbuckle with ink-stained fingers and a stack of ledgers taller than a man. Thomas presented the marriage certificate. Arbuckle squinted at it, then at Ilara, then at the Reverend's accompanying note classifying the union as a Christian service arrangement. "This is irregular," Arbuckle muttered. "The woman is listed here as a ward of the Office of Indian Affairs. Was agency consent obtained for matrimonial release?" Thomas had prepared for this. The Reverend, as a federal liaison for the agency's assimilation program, authorized it. The marriage is the service. Arbuckle tapped the paper. But is it an asterisk marriage under territorial law or an indenture? The two have different registries. He was pointing to the very loophole Holt and Sweeney hoped to exploit. If classified as an indenture, Ilara had no spousal rights. The bank could claim the marriage was a sham, and the property could be seized as assets acquired under fraudulent pretenses. Ilara, who had remained silent, spoke then. Her voice was clear, devoid of the accent she sometimes used to seem less threatening. "Sir, the contract specifies matrimony. The ceremony used the words husband and wife. I cook his food, I tend his children, I share his name. If it is not a marriage, then what is it, and what does that make me?" Arbuckle looked uncomfortable. He was a bureaucrat, not a theologian or a bigot. He dealt in categories. The law is silent on unions with indigenous parties, he said, but territorial silence defaults to federal precedent, and federal precedent is muddled. Here Ilara played her hidden card. She had not spent her time at the agency idly. She had listened, learned, and asked questions of a sympathetic teacher about a famous case back east. In the case of Standing Bear versus Crook, she said, the legal name foreign on her tongue but precise, a federal judge ruled that an Indian is a person under the law, entitled to habeas corpus. If I am a person, can I not be a wife? Arbuckle was stunned into silence. Thomas looked at Ilara with sheer astonishment. She had armed herself with the white man's own law. The clerk exhaled heavily. I cannot make a ruling, but I can register it in the matrimonial ledger with a footnote for the contractual reference. It will be unusual, but it will be recorded as a marriage. He opened a massive book, dipped his pen, and inscribed their names, Thomas Alastair Caldwell and Ilara Itzier Caldwell. In the remarks column, he wrote only, see attached contract for service context. It was a bureaucratic fudge, but it was a victory. They had forced the territory's own machinery to inscribe their union as legitimate. They walked out of the courthouse with a certified copy, a flimsy piece of paper that felt heavier than gold. They used this paper as a shield. Their next stop was the land office, where Thomas presented the certified marriage record alongside the bank's foreclosure notice. He argued that the morality clause was void, as his marriage was now a territorially recognized fact. The land office clerk, disinterested in the bank's social crusade, agreed the clause was unenforceable if the marriage was legal. He stamped a stay on the foreclosure, pending review. Finally, they visited the federal marshal's office. The same marshal who had listened to Reverend Holt was presented with the certified record. The marriage is registered, Thomas stated. There is no fraud. The matter is settled. The marshal, seeing the paper and wanting no part of a messy, politically charged domestic dispute, agreed to close the inquiry. They returned to Clear Fork not as conquering heroes, but as a fact the town could no longer legally wish away. The news of their Cheyenne trip spread, but the details were murky. The only thing that mattered was the result. The Caldwells still owned their land, and the law had not struck them down. This silent victory did not bring acceptance. It brought a cold, grudging truce. Reverend Holt's sermons grew more abstract. Elias Sweeney at the bank, thwarted, treated Thomas with a frosty, professional distance, but did not reinstate the surcharge. His wife Abigail saw to that. The schoolmarm, Miss Alice, relented under pressure from the Dobson and Blacksmith families, and the Caldwell children were quietly readmitted to school. The war of overt persecution was over. The long campaign of building a life began. The foal was born in the spring of 1888, a sturdy sorrel colt with a white blaze. It was the first tangible yield of their partnership. They sold it to a cavalry outpost for $60, a sum that bought them seed, tools, and a year's grace on their other debts. The horse operation, Ilara's brainchild, was working. In the house, the word mama, once a weapon, became a truth. It started with Lily, who had never known another mother. Then Eva let it slip while half asleep. Elijah used it when he was proud of a calving. Jacob was last. He called her Ilara for months after Cheyenne. Then one day he came in from the fields, his hands blistered, and said, "Mama, the bay mare's got a stone in her hoof." He didn't pause, didn't flinch. It was simply a statement of fact. She was the person to tell. She was Mama. Thomas watched this integration not as a loss of his first wife, but as a healing of a wound he thought would kill his children. His relationship with Ilara evolved from a pact of mutual defense into a deep, quiet companionship. They were partners in every sense. He taught her to read legal documents. She taught him to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of the soil. They shared a bed not out of passion initially, but out of solidarity and shared exhaustion. In time, that too changed, deepening into a respectful, abiding love forged in a shared furnace. The surprising detail, the one not recorded in any ledger, was Ilara's secret correspondence. Through the postmaster's nephew, a boy she treated for a fever, she began sending and receiving letters to the Fort Washakie Agency, but not to the agents, to other women like her contract wives in other isolated settlements. She wrote in a simple code, sharing knowledge, remedies for childbed fever, how to preserve meat without salt, which white man's laws to quote for protection. She created a whisper network, a silent sisterhood of survival across the territory. It was her true legacy, one of practical rebellion. The years turned. The children grew. Jacob took over more of the horse breeding. Eva married the blacksmith's son. Elijah went to a technical school in Cheyenne. Lily became the first Caldwell to attend a teacher's college back east. The ranch paid off its mortgage in 1895. The final lingering thread of the old conflict was severed in 1901. Reverend Silas Holt, an old man now lay dying. He sent a strange last request to see Elara Caldwell. Curiosity, not forgiveness, compelled her to go. His room was dark, smelling of camphor and decay. He looked at her, his eyes still sharp. "I thought you were a sin," he rasped. "I thought I was saving a soul, a community, but you just built a barn. You raised children, you healed the sick. You were never a symbol, you were just a person." He seemed bewildered by this simple fact he had spent years weaponizing. "Did you ever hate us?" Elara considered the old man, the architect of so much pain. "Hate is a fire that burns the one who holds it," she said, echoing an Arapaho saying. "I was too busy building something that would not burn." He died a week later. With him died the last organized opposition to their place in the valley. Thomas passed in 1920, quiet in his sleep beneath the old oak by the garden. Elara lived another 7 years. In her final days, her grandchildren around her, she was presented with a newspaper article. It detailed a ruling by the Oregon Supreme Court from 1921, a case called Paquet versus Johnson. The court had annulled the 33-year marriage of a native woman, Ophelia Paquet, to a white man, stripping her of her inheritance. Elara read it slowly, her old eyes tracing the lines. She put the paper down, a profound sadness in her gaze. "The law is a slow river," she said, "but the land remembers." When Elara Itzier Caldwell died in 1927, she was buried beside Thomas. Her headstone, paid for by her children, bore 2 names, the one given and the one chosen. The ranch passed to Jacob, who had long since stopped seeing any distinction between his father's blood and his mother's teaching. The Caldwell place became known, quietly, for 2 things: the finest horses in the county and a garden of wildflowers that bloomed with stubborn profusion where nothing should have grown. Travelers on the old road would sometimes stop, asking about the unusual blend of prairie flax and cultivated roses that tumbled over the fence. Old-timers in Clear Fork, their prejudices softened by time and necessity, would just say, "That's the Caldwell place, Elara's garden." The railroad, when it finally came through the valley in the 1930s, did curve around the ridge, just as the men with maps had predicted decades before. But it wasn't due to stubbornness. The surveyors found the bedrock on the Caldwell land too costly to blast through. The company rerouted, saving money. The sign Thomas and Elara had metaphorically, "for sale," was made literal by geology. The legal battle they fought, the quiet registration of a name in a ledger, did not change the world. It did not overturn the anti-miscegenation laws that would persist in some states for another 40 years. But it saved one small, specific world. It proved that a union born in prejudice and practicality could transform into something enduring, something that could bend the arc of a family's destiny toward resilience. Their story was not one of grand legal precedent, but of subtle human precedent. It proved that sometimes the most radical act is not to flee a hostile world, but to dig in, to plant, to build, and to force that world to make room for you, to become, against all odds, simply neighbors. A fact, a name in a ledger that refused to be erased. This is where the documentary of their struggle ends, and the quiet history of their legacy begins. A legacy written not in laws, but in the stubborn roots of a garden that still blooms, and in the bloodlines of horses and families that remember where they came from. So what do we do with a story like this? One that didn't change the course of a nation, but quietly altered the destiny of a single valley. The Caldwells' struggle wasn't recorded in history books. You won't find Elara's name in legal textbooks beside the landmark cases. Their victory was measured in inches, not miles, a line in a clerk's ledger, a child calling a woman mama, a garden that refused to die. But in those inches, we see the true, granular texture of how change actually happens, not through sweeping declarations, but through the unbearable, daily pressure of people simply refusing to disappear. Ilara didn't set out to be a symbol, she set out to survive, and in doing so, she became a blueprint for resilience. This pattern repeats across the hidden history of the American frontier. For every notorious outlaw or celebrated pioneer, there were countless Ilaras, native women, black women, immigrant women, who entered hostile territories as brides, as laborers, as prisoners, and through sheer force of will, remade the definition of family. They navigated a legal system designed to erase them, using its own obscure rules as footholds. They faced a prejudice so total it felt like weather, and they simply learned to build shelters that would last. The story of Ilara and Thomas forces us to re-examine the old, clean narratives of westward expansion. It wasn't just a saga of brave settlers conquering wild land. It was also a messy, painful, and often silent story of human collision, and sometimes unexpected fusion. It's the story of how a community's most despised member can become its most essential one. How prejudice often breaks not in a dramatic courtroom moment, but in a quiet barn at night, when a child realizes the person he was taught to hate is the one keeping the horses calm. The lingering question isn't whether love conquered all, it didn't. The question is, what does a society lose when it writes people out of its story? What wisdom, what strength, what beauty is extinguished in the name of purity? The Caldwell Ranch, with its wildflowers and strong horses, stands as an answer. It prospered not in spite of its mixed origins, but because of them. The diversity of knowledge, Arapaho land stewardship, European animal husbandry, a woman's healing touch, a man's stubborn perseverance, created a resilience that a monoculture could never achieve. Today, the wage gap for Native women persists. Murder rates remain horrifically high. The legacies of those old laws and attitudes cast long shadows, but so do the legacies of the survivors. Every time a person chooses connection over fear, chooses to see humanity where they were taught to see a stereotype, they are walking the path Ilara and Thomas carved out of the Wyoming hardpan. Their story ends with a simple, powerful truth. Sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is stay, and build, and plant a garden in the very soil that tried to reject you, to say, with your life, I am here, I belong, and I will make this place better for having been in it. If you found this story of hidden history and quiet resilience compelling, there are countless more like it waiting to be told. We delve into the forgotten corners of the past every week. Subscribe and join us for the next story of the people history almost forgot, but whose legacy refuses to fade.